Dellar, welcome to BELTA Day 2015. How are you?
I'm okay.
You're okay?
I'm okay. Better for having finished the talk.
Really?
It's always a nice feeling just to have done it, and you can then sort of relax for the rest of the day. So.
Okay, yeah. Nice. So what a great way to start off our BELTA Day 2015 with your plenary session on technology and principles in language teaching.
Thank you.
Your journey into becoming a teacher has been one across music, lousy jobs, English literature study, and then eventually you could talk with a friend who inspired you into joining the field.
Yeah, trick me.
Oh, you feel like he tricked you?
No, but he managed to say just the right thing at just the right time that resonated with me in a particular way. And I think
place, time. Yeah.
Had he not told me that disliking most of my teachers from school was a good reason for becoming a teacher, I may well have just ignored him, and it was the right sentence at the right time for me, so it kind of...
It was the perfect goal.
Yeah, it was sort of like, oh, I've never thought about it like that before.
So I can do... It's like a mission to be better and show that it can be better.
Exactly, okay. And you know, teaching as a form of revenge.
As a form of revenge? Like warriors.
Well, just probably like many people, a lot of my high school teachers were not particularly inspiring, and some of them really downright unpleasant.
Okay.
And a lot of my experience of teachers was as of not particularly nice or admirable people. I had a few that were great, but what he sort of persuaded me to do was to look at how you do that differently. And so that was really good inspiration for me when I first started out, was to sort of think about what was it I didn't like about my French classes, for example, at high school. How can I be a different teacher to that? How can I do it differently? And it was great because I've said it in the BELTA interview thing there, but teaching was the first job I'd ever had where I felt fully able to be myself. And almost every other job I'd had before, like shop work or building work or whatever, it requires you to kind of reduce yourself down to fit the space of the job, whereas I think teaching allows you to expand into the space. And you realise quite quickly when you're starting out as a teacher that being yourself and just being like an authentic person,
it's like a liberation.
It's a real liberation, and I think it's why a lot of teachers love the job. You know, God knows it's not for the pay.
So we're 12 years later, right?
Yes. No, we're 22 years later. This was 1983.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah.
That's true. 22 years later, so that's quite a journey again. So you already lived like two lives up until now. It feels like it sometimes, yeah. We are just curious to know, where does this passion, this passionate view on technology nowadays come from?
For me?
Yes.
It's a good question. I think it kind of comes from 3 or 4 places. I think it comes from, first and foremost, what interests me about the classroom is the kind of human interaction element of it. And what attracted me to teaching was I like being with people, and I like meeting people, and I like working with people. And you notice it increasingly that you live in a kind of disconnected world which is facilitated by technology. I was watching what's it called, Her, the Joaquin Phoenix movie recently with Scarlett Johansson as the voice of this mobile phone, and great film I think, because it's like everyone's walking around in their own little personalised bubble relationship with technology, but when they actually have to interact with each other they struggle because it needs to be mediated for them, and that really worries me, and I don't think that's somewhere we want to be going as a society, as an individual. I think I've also had issues because, like a lot of teachers, I've worked in contexts where there's a top-down drive to be seen to be using technology. I was just talking to Joris, one of the guys outside, and he was saying, oh, it's exactly what's happening in my school. The boss is saying we need to be ICT driven. And I was saying, well, really, you need to be learning driven. Actually, you know, it may be that ICT can play a role in that, but if you're starting by being ICT driven, it's just the wrong goal. And I think a lot of what's happening in a lot of centres is there's a top-down desire to be seen to be using digital, and that's leading to resentment, frustration, confusion, and problems for teachers, because, you know, we're at the end of it kind of being told that we're somehow not good teachers because we're not following this top-down drive, whereas actually teaching and learning happens in all kinds of contexts.
That's true, but on the other side, the other part of the class are digital natives, as we call them, and it's Generation Y, Z, people that are fed with technology, so they have a completely different way of processing things as well. So what is the good balance then between our old school approach, which we like and which we think is valuable, and the top-down push of technology?
I'm not convinced by the whole digital natives, digital non-natives argument, because I mean, I'm technically a digital non-native in that I grew up in a pre-internet era, but I know that my grasp of technology is much, much better than a lot of 18-year-olds. You know, I can use technology for all kinds of things that they can't. My co-author's got a daughter who's 19, and I know that both of us, who are digital non-natives according to that definition, are much more savvy about how the web works, what's driving it, the issues around it, what we can do with it. You know, she basically uses Facebook and WhatsApp. And I think it's a misnomer to assume that because students use this stuff outside of classroom, they expect or demand or require to be taught using those mechanisms. And I mean, actually, there's a lot of stuff recently about how paper books are kind of having a resurgence of sales. Kids are actually, you know, for everyone there's a problem with digital stuff, which is it engenders a short attention span, okay? The whole nature of being online is it's kind of flick, flick, zap, zap, zap. You know, it stops you listening to music in the way you used to, it stops you reading in the way you used to, and at some point you need to sit down and engage with proper, serious, real content, and whether that's a face-to-face conversation or that's a book that you read from beginning to end rather than just a blog post, or whether it's an album that you sit and listen to and you play the whole thing all the way through and you experience it as a whole piece of work. I think there's a deep need in humans to have that kind of bigger, more holistic kind of experience.
True, because the flow of information can be very
And you know, just because kids use technology outside of classroom, as do I, it doesn't mean it has to be brought into the classroom. You know, people are flexible, people can learn in all kinds of ways, and I just think, you know, it's like saying that they play a lot of football. Therefore, what should all of our language teaching be football rooted or football oriented? Obviously not. You know, there's obviously other things that they need to learn about as well. And I think just because you don't necessarily do something or you're interested in something outside of the classroom, it doesn't mean that you might not be. You know, and for me, one of the real worries with the technological thing is, I saw a plenary at ITEFL this year by a woman called Joy Egbert. And it was a sort of, it's very American, and it's very kind of cult of the individual. And it was basically about how tablets allow you to personalise the learning space. So, you know, I know that you're interested in fishing and you're interested in golf. So I give you a text about fishing and you a text about golf. And I'm looking at it thinking, well, how do you know that you might not be a bit more interested in golf and you might not be a bit more interested in fishing, actually? You know, part of a teacher's job is to go, you maybe didn't know that you might be interested in this, but check it out, it's actually quite interesting. And you kind of go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And I think also that kind of atomised classroom is a real problem, because it's sort of saying that the individuals are more important than the group.
The expectations are already stuck onto the student.
And for me, as a teacher, the fundamental sort of principle is the group is more important than the individuals, and that you have to kind of bring everyone in the group together as a unit of learning and a unit of shared experience, and they all have to kind of recognise that their own progress is it's a social vision in a sense. Your own well-being is dependent on the well-being of other people, and you know, for me, that's a sort of fundamental belief about the world. And I worry that technology can lead to a kind of breaking down of everyone being in their own little bubble. And
which is happening.
It is, and I just don't think that it's a safe or sensible model of how society should work, kind of hyper-individualism.
So then, in the perfect world, let's say, how would, because besides the Lexical Lab, there is a new book coming up.
Yes.
But there was also maybe an idea of opening an own school. So how would that school, that perfect school, that Hugh Dellar school look like? What would make it your school?
Well, first and foremost, it would be good teachers, be they native or non-native, who are driven by the kind of principles I was talking about in the plenary, which is, you know, it's a language-rich classroom, it's a classroom where the language is useful, you're using the students as a resource a lot, you're driven by thinking about what desirable outcomes you want to achieve with a particular group of students you've got. And if that includes using technology, great, but it doesn't necessarily have to. For me, the most important thing is just, are the goals sensible, and is the road that you're taking to get to those particular goals sensible? And is the teacher engaging, interesting, good with language, good with people?
So interactive whiteboards, yes, but
Or not necessarily.
Or not necessarily.
You know, not necessarily.
Chalk and blackboard.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time schools spend vast amounts of money on things like interactive whiteboards and then kind of don't necessarily get the results they want. And I mean, I'd rather see, spend the money on your teachers, spend the money on developing your teachers in some kind of way. Just sticking, you know, why not use this? This is fine. I'd be quite happy just using this.
Yeah.
You can project onto this. I mean, I still think in 5 years IWBs are going to be outdated anyway, because people are going to be using laptops and beaming onto whiteboards anyway, and you'll be able to do everything you can do with an IWB there.
All right.
You know, great if you've got them and you use them and you're good with them and you've got principles behind using them, but at the same time, it doesn't mean your teaching's any better because you've got an IWB.
So Hugh, what about the Lexical Lab? Can you tell us what do we need to know about it?
It's at www.lexicallab.com. It's basically a website I set up with my co-author Andrew Walkley because we wanted to have a space online where teachers who are interested in more kind of lexically oriented perspectives on teaching, looking to move beyond a kind of grammar plus single words way of thinking about teaching, can go to discuss issues. And it's interesting for me because I mean I started teaching in '93 and I read the lexical approach in '95, and I was probably among the first wave of teachers who was really influenced by that way of thinking about language. And it really kind of chimed with my experience of learning foreign languages, and it helped me understand how language works in a lot more depth. And I think basically it's an approach to language, the lexical approach, rather than necessarily pedagogy or teaching. And I think for a long time there's been spaces for other teachers who are interested in other things to discuss. So things like Scott Thornbury and his Dogme group. They've had a kind of Dogme discussion board, they've had an online space, and it allows teachers to kind of go, I'm a Dogme teacher. And I think for a lot of us, we kind of knew we were lexical teachers, but we didn't have a space or an umbrella under which we could meet and discuss things.
Okay.
So it's basically a space where we have blog posts, we talk about things we've been thinking about.
Share ideas.
We have guests. So we've had Bruno, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Leys, L-E-Y-S. Les, okay. Bruno Les has done a guest post for us, and we've had lots of sort of different people posting various things. We also have a kind of section on there called resources, and people send us exercises that they've taught in the classroom and just say, how would you have dealt with this? We talk through what we would have done with it, what questions we would have asked, what we would have explored in terms of the examples. We have another section called Key Principles, where basically we're just slowly setting out 500 words at a time, core beliefs that we have about language, language learning, language teaching. Sort of, you know, it's this kind of slowly built manifesto of sorts.
Over the years.
And over the years. We have another section called Chunk of the Day, which sadly doesn't operate daily because we just don't get around to doing it. But it's where we look at common chunks of language and we talk about how you might teach them, how you might explore them, how they work, what examples you might give. So I just wrote one the other day about in the run-up to, because it's the election coming up in the UK and you hear it on the news all the time about in the run-up to the election.
Okay.
And it's a very under-taught kind of chunk of language, I think. And so we look at what you might do with that in the classroom.
What do you think, what do you think of the concept checking questions? Because this is what we as teachers nowadays tend to...
Funny you should mention it, because this is what we've been blogging about for the last 2 or 3 weeks on there. Yeah.
Okay.
I think the problem with concept checking questions is they work fine for grammar. Okay? If you're checking a present perfect sentence and the sentence is something like, I've seen it already, and you ask, did it happen in the past, present or future? Does it have a connection to the present? Fine. That works. 2 closed questions to check the meaning. With vocabulary, it doesn't work because the problem with vocabulary isn't the context or the meaning. The problem is what the word does and how it works. And I think it leads to a lot of really bad vocabulary teaching. And I'll just give you one example. When I did my CELTA course, we had to do a little exercise on CCQs, concept checking questions. And one of the bits of vocabulary was to be kicked out of something, okay? And we were told the correct concept checking questions were to be kicked out of the team. Was I in the team before? Am I in the team now? Okay? From a student's point of view, it's sort of idiotic because what you do is to kind of go, yes, no, finished. There's no push on the students. For me now, if I was dealing with that question, much more interesting things to ask are, I think of them as being questions about the language you're looking at which generate connected language, okay? Because if you only learn he was kicked out of the team, why? I don't know, my teacher didn't help me to say that. So, you know, for me, much more interesting questions are things like, okay, he was kicked out of the team, why? Okay, for being late for training all the time, after being photographed inhaling helium gas in a hotel room, for punching the coach. Anything else you can be kicked out of, okay? Kicked out of your house, kicked out of class.
Because the lexical meaning of kicked out, implement something.
And it connected to the other language, and if you're ever going to use it or hear it, it's not going to exist in isolation. And so learning to ask better questions about vocabulary is a really fundamental thing about teaching that we don't talk about enough in language teaching, and we've still got concept checking questions dropped onto vocabulary that reduce it to a really kind of basic level of discussion. And so you take get kicked out of, I mean, you know, anything else you can get kicked out of. A house, okay? He got kicked out of the house by? Well, could be his wife. Yeah, it could be, okay? Could be the landlord. Yeah, it could be. It could be his parents. It could be, okay? And actually, for all of those three, there's different reasons.
Yes.
Kicked out of the house by his wife, why?
Yeah.
Well, she went through his emails and found out he'd been cheating on her. Kicked out of the house by his landlord, why? He hadn't paid the rent for 6 years. Kicked out of the house by his parents, why? He was 35 and they decided he needed to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. And what also happens when you ask those kind of questions is it provides space for students to personalise that language if they want to. So once I asked this question about get kicked out of, and one of the Swedish lads in the class went, for example, okay, you can be kicked out of a nightclub. So that's right, yeah, who by? Because what do you call these big scary guys, like with the big arms, bouncers, okay? Yeah. Why, Henrik, for example? For example, throwing up in the middle of the dance floor. That's a very specific example, Henrik. You know, he was kicked out of the club by the bouncer for throwing up in the middle of the dance floor. Anything I need to know here? It was my first night in London. So, okay, so I'll see where you're coming from. And I wouldn't have learned this particular piece of information about him had I not been asking very specific kind of language-driven questions about the vocabulary. Okay. So if you go to Lexical Lab now, I mean, we've got a whole series of posts we've been doing about asking better questions about vocabulary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll definitely do that. And as being third-year students in teacher training, a piece of advice, because when we go to our internship schools, we tend to have two purposes there. We need to teach and show our didactics competences, let's say, and on the other hand, we have these mentors sitting in the back of the class evaluating us. And
are the mentors teachers who already work in the schools? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. There are teachers who allow us to teach their classes. Okay. So it's, for example, it will be an English teacher. Okay. Probably someone that is not really familiar with technology, and then it starts off like a kind of workshop, and they sit in the back of the class taking notes of all the apps and tools we're learning, and they push us to show us as much as possible. How can we, as graduating teacher training students, can find the perfect balance in a new school, in a team where we have technology and old school mind people? Yeah,
it's a big question, I think. I think the first thing is, ultimately, you're not there to train your mentors how to use technology. You're there to teach the kids English. And that has to be what drives what you're doing in the classroom. It may be that you don't use any technology sometimes when you're doing that, because it may just be that you've got a particular goal in mind, you've got a communicative outcome that you're working towards with your students, and, you know, say you decide, I don't know, I'm going to teach them how to give foreign visitors to their city a guided tour of their city in English, okay? Maybe you've got some material that does that, you've got some language in mind, you've got a kind of model of how that conversation might work. It may be within that you then zap up a kind of slideshow of Brussels, and that they're working in pairs, and you're saying, okay, in pairs, you're the tourist, you're the driver, use some of the language, explain what the sites are, and they're on a 10-second delay, and you're using the technology like that, fine. If the purpose of bringing that technology into the classroom is in order to facilitate a practice of a clear, explicit bunch of language with a clear, explicit goal, I think that's fine. I think the kind of two risks that you run is, one, you may end up kind of overusing tech because you want to be seen to be one step ahead of the mentors at the back and kind of going, hey, I'm a digital native, me, check me out with my technology. And if you're not careful, it becomes tech for the sake of tech as opposed to tech for the sake of learning. I think the other thing is just at some point there will be pressures on all of you to be ICT driven, you know, and a lot of schools like to present themselves and market themselves as being ICT driven. And ultimately, it's the wrong goal. You know, your goal needs to be, you need to be student driven and learning driven. And if you can sublimate ICT within that, great, you know, brilliant, that's really good teaching. If all you're saying is, we use technology, why, to do what, to achieve what kind of goals, with what sort of purposes, it's not enough. But it may be that that's the official mantra and that you have to pay some lip service to that and that basically you have to kind of go, yes, we're down with that idea, very sensible, good. And then you go back in your classroom and say, anyway, no one's watching me anywhere. And you know, you check there's no spy cameras and you get on with your teaching. And I think a lot of the time, those kind of top-down initiatives, they're not thought out. They're not thought out in terms of, they probably don't start by asking you, what do you use already? Where are you at with your technology? They probably just say, this is what we have to aspire to, and you have to drag yourself up to here. Yeah? If they're good, they'll start with you and they'll kind of ask you, what do you use already? Is there anything you're interested in learning about? Okay, I'll build in 2 hours this afternoon for you to explore that. That's very, very rare in my experience. Much more common is they just drop it on you from a great height and expect you to kind of shoulder that burden. And part of the survival in institutions may be just learning how to play that game.
Play the game,
close
the classroom door, be liberated in front of your own classroom.
Exactly, and then teach them the way that you teach them that you feel best with. And then if they ask you, did you fulfill your ICT goals? Of course I did, yeah.
Let's finish off with that idea. Yeah, tick the
box. And a lot of the time it is just literally tick boxing. It really is. That they, you know, I mean, we used to have it at Westminster when I was there, where people would come around and check, have you set up a Moodle? We'd say, I've set one up, and none of my students use it. But there it is, look, I've done it. Okay? Good, good. Do the students like it? They love it. They love it.
Tick the box.
Tick the box. Around. Leave me alone for another year. Come back next year with a new initiative that I have to pay lip service to. You know.
Great idea.
Your bosses won't thank me for telling you that. But,
thank you. Yeah.